For us, the primary question is, why did Jesus overturn the tables in the temple? We were both raised with one explanation and have come to believe another one entirely.
I'm not as practiced at this as Sara is, so maybe a little sympathy. We'll see how this goes.
I just foibled over the word table. You can probably hold up to that bar.
I'll give it my best, and I'll try not to read your parts. A man named Rabbi Hillel was said to live an extraordinarily long life, born around 110 BCE, about a century before Jesus' birth, and lived into Jesus' early years around 10 to 20 CE. His primary rival in thought was Shammai. Once, they say, a Gentile approached Hillel and Shammai and challenged them to explain the Torah to him while he stood on one foot. Shammai dismissed the man. Sound familiar? Hillel accepted the question, but gently chastised the man by responding, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole of the Torah. The rest is the explanation. Go and learn." If this brings to mind anything Jesus said, I don't think it is a coincidence. The Gospel of Mark records an episode that rings similar to that experienced by Shammai and Hillel. This happens during the testing of Jesus' teaching and authority in the days that followed the temple episode that my mother-in-law Joan read a few moments ago. In it, Jesus was asked which commandment is the greatest. Jesus answered that the Shema, this morning's Deuteronomy passage, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, is the greatest. And loving our neighbor as ourselves, this morning's Leviticus passage, read by my mother Elizabeth, is the second greatest. These commands are at the heart of how Jesus understood God's nature, one of love, justice, and compassion. And they are central to the individual and collective ways in which we are to live out our lives. They are also going to be central to why Jesus was at the temple on the last Monday of his life. In order to explain this, let us provide a little more context.
Jesus lived from around 4 BCE to around 30 CE. He was raised in Galilee, an area that had been recolonized by faithful Jews and was an impoverished backwater of the Roman Empire. In particular, he grew up in Nazareth, a tiny village that was 4 miles from the city of Sepphoris. Sepphoris had been part of a revolt against the Roman Empire in 4 BCE in response to the death of Herod, who had brutally oppressed everyone under his reign. In response to the revolt, the empire had sent in legions of troops to reconquer the city, leveling much of it and selling those who had led the revolt into slavery. So did you notice? Approximately the year Jesus was born, the city under whose shadow he was raised was leveled by the empire. It's even likely that his father's work was in rebuilding the city. That revolt and its aftermath would have infiltrated his consciousness in ways similar to kids born in 2001 in New York City.
The Roman Empire was an empire in all the traditional ways that empires are empires. It existed to extract wealth from the people it conquered in order to give the wealth to the powerful elites. In his book, Jesus, Uncovering the Life, Teachings, and Relevance of a Religious Revolutionary, which was chosen by the Intersectional Justice Committee for our January book discussion, Marcus Borg refers to the Roman Empire as a pre-industrial agricultural domination system. Domination systems emerged around 5,000 years ago when humans figured out how to produce metal and domesticate animals. at roughly the same time. Domesticating animals enabled larger-scale agriculture, and thus agricultural surplus and larger-scale societies. Surplus also meant enabling the existence of wealth, which, when combined with larger societies, led to motivation for domination at a larger scale. Pre-industrial agricultural domination looked something like devising systems through which taxation enabled wealth to flow upwards, thus causing people to live on the edge of subsistence, and not just poverty, but indentured servitude and slavery. In other words, virtually everyone who wasn't part of the elite was a peasant. Agriculture, and thus land, was a family's primary source of productivity. A bad year for crops could lead to debt and subsistence. It was all but impossible, and once debt had been entered into, it was all but impossible to produce enough to pay off debt. As little as one bad year for crops could lead to debt, potentially the loss of your land and indentured servitude in which you were working the same land, but someone else owned it and gained the productivity from your land and your labor. As little as 2 or 3 bad years could lead to loss of land and slavery. In the system Jesus lived under, wealth was thus derived from farming, and the wealth flowed up to the ruler and his aristocrats. In fact, between 1/2 and 2/3 of all production ended up in the hands of the elite, 1 to 2% of the society, making them very wealthy. They used some of this wealth to maintain armies in order to keep the wealth, and the role of religion was to legitimate the concentration of wealth by claiming the ruler as ruling by divine will. Some of this should sound familiar from either history or the newspaper. In this system, the poor, who comprised at least 90% of the population, worked very hard and died very young. Those who survived childhood lived to an average age of 30. The elite lived to an average age of 70. Now, the Roman Empire wasn't unique at all. This was exactly the same domination system that the Proto-Israelites had encountered in Egypt, and from which they had experienced God leading them into freedom. This was also the same domination system that their own kings had often attempted to implement, although their kings were kept in check a bit by the prophets constantly calling them out.
This system was well known, but stood in marked contrast to the world as envisioned by God, shared by Moses, articulated by the prophets, and sought by the people. The vision laid out in the Torah starts by giving each family access to their own land to farm. It's designed carefully, intended to prevent any system where a group of people could economically dominate any other people, and thus intended to prevent a situation where a peasant class could exist and be dominated. The vision of God in the Torah involved each family having access to land and being able to reap its benefits. The vision of God in the Torah requires making food accessible even to the widows, orphans, and foreigners who were exactly the people who wouldn't have any access to land. The vision of God in the Torah requires sharing 10% of food production in order to both feed the priests and feed the hungry. The vision of God in the Torah aims to keep society level so that no one dominates and no one is dominated, which was the faith of the Jews. And that is the faith that the temple was built to support. The temple stood as a symbol of the faith, as a way to remember the faith, and as a way to enact the faith. The temple stood near but apart from the king's palace, with an intention to keep power separate and accountable.
The Roman Empire preferred to keep local leadership in place when it took over new areas. However, it made the leadership accountable to the empire and required that the leadership do the work of gathering up the wealth of the people to pay its taxes. Furthermore, it replaced local leadership as it deemed necessary to maintain stability and keep the money flowing upward. To be clear, this means Rome appointed the high priest, and the appointment lasted only so long as Rome was pleased with him. From 6 CE to 66 CE, a period of 60 years, Rome appointed 18 high priests. The Roman Empire wasn't stupid. It knew that the real power in Israel by the time of Jesus was in the temple. There hadn't been a monarch in centuries. The power that the temple derived from its function and symbolism as a centerpiece of living out God's vision for a just society was thus co-opted for the sake of the domination system and its insatiable hunger for greater wealth. Thus, the temple that stood as an emblem and reinforcement of God's justice and compassion was co-opted by the pre-industrial agricultural domination system of the Roman Empire.
The temple, meant to function as an equalizer, a seat of prayer and the home of the priests who taught what God's vision was. The temple, by the time of Jesus, was being used to extract wealth from the peasants for the benefit of the already wealthy. Jesus, after his upbringing as a peasant near the aftermath of a revolt, had a particularly high awareness of this system and its brokenness. He was interested in breaking the perceived power of the temple, which would decrease or maybe even break its usefulness to those in the domination system who wanted to abuse the power. Which brings us to today's story.
Many Christians, when they think of the seminal moment in Jesus' life and career, probably think of the resurrection. In contrast, I understand this story, the story of the indictment of the temple, to be the seminal moment of Jesus' career. In the version we read in Mark, Jesus and his followers enter the temple and begin what I would recognize as a disruptive act. They knock over the tables and throw out the vendors and the money changers. For most of our lives, we've probably heard this story in a similar way to the summary provided by biblical scholar N.T. Wright in his book, Mark for Everyone. He quotes, "Many people have thought that Jesus was simply protesting against commercialization. On this view, he only intended to clean up the temple, to stop all this non-religious activity and leave it as a place for pure prayer and worship."
Sound familiar? It's how we were raised. In Marcus Borg's book, he reminds us that the courtyard of the temple was 40 acres. That simple fact gives us reason to question the narrative we've been taught. To create a notable disruption within a space that large would require intentionality and a plan, and more than one person. Which suggests that this could not have simply been a temper tantrum response to commercial activity, and therefore opens the question even wider. Why would Jesus have planned a disruption at the temple?
But first, was this really a disruption? Through Sarah's Subversive Women of the Bible sermon series, we've been talking about subversive actions for months. And this is classic subversive activism 101, staging a disruption. Mark affirms this by sandwiching the story in between the two halves of the fig tree story, using the fig tree as a symbol for the temple. In that story, the morning before the temple episode, as Jesus and his followers are on their way to the temple, Jesus notes that a fig tree has not produced any fruit, and he curses it. Never mind that figs were out of season. The NRSV version of the Bible titles the concluding section, "The Lesson from the Withered Fig Tree." In it, when they pass by that fig tree the morning after the temple disruption, the tree is already dead. N.T. Wright explains, but Mark makes it clear by placing the temple incident within the two halves of the fig tree story that he sees Jesus' actions as, again, a dramatic acted parable of judgment. This was Jesus' way of announcing God's condemnation of the temple itself and all that it had become in the national life of Israel. In other words, Jesus judges the tree and it dies. Sorry, I lost my place.
Jesus judges the tree and it dies. Jesus judges the temple to kill its power, in particular, its power to dominate. So why did Jesus plan a disruption at the temple? So that he could indict the temple. Knowing that between this action and his Palm Sunday entrance the day before, it would likely result in his death. Indeed, it is within the temple passage that the author of Mark notes for the first time that the chief priests and scribes decided to kill Jesus and began plotting to this effect. The author of Mark illustrated Jesus' plan through the fig tree, but a contemporaneous audience would also have recognized it through Jesus' own reported words. Quote, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers," end quote. Marcus Borg helps us to better understand these references, explaining them as a combination of Isaiah 56:7, the temple is a house of prayer for all nations, the all nations being super significant because it's not just Israel, and Jeremiah 7:11. The latter is part of what is called Jeremiah's temple sermon, in which, according to Borg, Jeremiah warned that it would be destroyed unless those who worshiped there began to practice justice. Earlier, that passage reads, "If you truly amend your ways and doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after gods to your own hurt, then I, God, will dwell with you in this place."
Borg goes on. Then, still speaking in the name of God, Jeremiah said, "Has this house, the temple, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight?" The phrase in Hebrew suggests not just thievery, but robbing with violence. In what sense had the temple become a den of robbers, a cave of violent ones? In Jeremiah, the meaning is apparent. It was a den of robbers precisely because it had become the center of an oppressive system that did not practice justice, but exploited the most vulnerable in society. It was an indictment of the powerful and wealthy elites of his day, centered in the monarchy and temple. Their everyday injustice made them robbers, and they thought of the temple as their safe house and place of security. Thus, when Jesus called the temple a den of robbers, he was not referring to the activity of the money changers and sellers of sacrificial animals. Rather, he indicted the temple authorities as robbers who collaborated with the robbers at the top of the imperial domination system. They had made the temple into a den of robbing and violence. Jesus' action was not a cleansing of the temple, but an indictment of the temple. The teaching explains the act. Indeed, it was the reason for the act. End quote.
So that's why Jesus planned a disruption of the temple. That's why it was worth it to him to accept the consequences of having publicly indicted the temple and its authority. Fairly serious consequences. We no longer live in a pre-industrial agricultural domination system, obviously. Now we live in a post-industrial, non-agricultural domination system. The rules are both different and the same. The work of the many is still used to enrich the few, although we have new ways of blaming the many for not being wealthy themselves. Our domination system is dependent on racism, sexism, transphobia, heteronormativity, xenophobia, and all other kinds and ways of dehumanizing God's beloved people. Our domination system falls apart when we look at each other, no matter what the difference is, and see another human being, a beloved person of God, worthwhile and worth listening to. However, it is not just that we are called to do this individually. Like Jesus, we need to pay attention to how our institutions, including our faith traditions, are being systematically used as part of a domination system. And then, if we want to follow Jesus, we need to disrupt the system. It turns out that the temple cleansing is not, as many of us thought, the one counter-example to an otherwise calm and loving Jesus. I hear that a lot. The story is the epitome of Jesus loving God's people. It is Jesus loving God's people enough to upset the system, to give them a chance, even when it would inevitably lead to his own death.
Today, we are similarly called to disrupt. It may or may not involve dramatic acts of disruption. However, when we see actions of thievery, of state-sanctioned robbery, of oppressive political systems that do not practice justice, and instead create legal structures for the exploitation of the most vulnerable in society, we are called to indict the powers that do such things and to seek ways to disrupt these actions. Look for the ways in which you can step outside of your normal behaviors in order to dramatize, shed light on injustice, and indict the powers behind it. Look for the ways in which you can step outside of your normal behavior and in order to advocate for the vulnerable, the marginalized, and exploited. Most importantly, look for the ways in which you can work collectively and organize in order to address the systems that marginalize and exploit the vulnerable. Imagine these actions and others like them. Sit with whatever discomfort these thoughts may bring. Pray over how you are called to respond. Then join with others and do as Jesus did. Amen.
Amen.